September 1944. The Allies stood on the edge of total victory. Paris had fallen. The Wehrmacht was in retreat. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower approved the most audacious airborne operation in military history, a lightning thrust across the Netherlands to end the war by Christmas. Operation Market Garden would drop 35,000 paratroopers behind enemy lines, seize 9 bridges in broad daylight, and punch a corridor straight into the heart of Germany. It was brilliant. It was bold, and it was a catastrophe. When the smoke cleared and 17,000 Allied soldiers lay dead, wounded, or captured, one man would take the fall. His name was Bernard Montgomery, but the real architect of the disaster sat silent in Supreme Headquarters. This is the story of how Dwight Eisenhower sacrificed a general to save his legacy. September 1944. The maps at Supreme Headquarters told a story no one wanted to hear. Just weeks earlier, the Allied armies had surged out of Normandy like a flood breaking through a dam. Paris had been liberated. The German Wehrmacht was in full retreat. Victory felt close enough to taste, but by early September that momentum had died, not from enemy fire, but from something far more mundane: fuel. General George Patton's Third Army sat motionless east of the Meuse River, his Sherman tanks reduced to silent steel monuments by empty fuel drums. To the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group had ground to a halt in Belgium, stalled not by German resistance, but by stretched supply lines that now ran all the way back to the beaches of Normandy. The Red Ball Express, the lifeline of the Allied advance, was buckling under impossible demands. Trucks broke down. Supplies vanished into the logistical black hole between the front and the rear. The war that had seemed won in August now threatened to drag on into 1945, or beyond. At his headquarters in Versailles, Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a nightmarish equation. Winter was coming. The German border loomed ahead, fortified by the Siegfried Line, a belt of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, and minefields that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. A frontal assault would be costly, slow, and brutal. Worse still, political pressure mounted from London. Churchill wanted results, and in the east, Soviet armies were racing toward Berlin. Eisenhower needed a breakthrough, fast. Enter Operation Market Garden. Montgomery proposed a daring vertical envelopment. Drop 3 airborne divisions deep behind German lines to seize a series of bridges across the rivers and canals of the Netherlands. If successful, the British XXX Corps would punch through on a single narrow highway, link up with the paratroopers, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and swing east into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. One thrust, one road, one chance to end the war before Christmas. It was audacious, it was risky, and Eisenhower approved it. On September 10, 1944, he signed the orders at SHAEF headquarters. Resources were redirected. Supplies earmarked for Patton's Third Army and Bradley's 12th Army Group were diverted north. Montgomery would get his chance. The plan called for 1,545 transport aircraft and 478 gliders to deliver over 34,000 paratroopers in a single afternoon, the largest airborne operation in history. The die was cast, the gamble was on. And the fate of the war now rested on a single bridge, 64 miles behind enemy lines, in a quiet Dutch town called Arnhem. September 17, 1944, 1:00 p.m. The skies over Holland turned black with aircraft. Wave after wave of C-47 transports roared north from airfields in England and France, their bellies heavy with paratroopers. Gliders filled with jeeps, anti-tank guns, and supplies trailed behind, towed by twin-engine tugs. Fighter escorts swept the flanks. Below, Dutch civilians looked up in disbelief as the largest airborne armada in history blotted out the sun. The 101st Airborne Division dropped near Eindhoven in the south. The 82nd Airborne descended on Nijmegen in the center. And 64 miles to the north, the British 1st Airborne Division, 10,000 men strong, floated down onto the flat farmland near Arnhem. The final bridge, the prize, the gateway to Germany. On paper, the plan was flawless. In reality, it was already falling apart. Weeks before the drop, British reconnaissance aircraft had photographed something deeply troubling near Arnhem. German tanks, SS Panzer divisions, battered but intact, refitting in the woods just miles from the planned landing zones. Major Brian Urquhart, a young intelligence officer, had seen the photos. He'd raised the alarm. He'd warned that dropping lightly armed paratroopers into the path of German armor was suicide. He was ignored, then removed from duty, sent on medical leave. Montgomery dismissed the reports as exaggerated. Eisenhower's staff at SHAEF buried them in bureaucracy. Why? Because admitting the risk meant scrapping the operation, and with it, any hope of ending the war in 1944. The political stakes were too high. The momentum is too precious. The gamble had to go forward. And so it did. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost led the 2nd Parachute Battalion in a desperate race toward Arnhem Bridge. They advanced through the narrow streets of the city, fighting off sporadic German resistance. By nightfall on September 17, Frost and roughly 740 men reached the northern ramp of the bridge. They dug in. They held. For 4 days and 3 nights, those men fought off an entire SS Panzer Corps. They had no heavy weapons, no tanks, no artillery, just rifles, grenades, and sheer will. German Panzer IVs and armored cars prowled the streets. Mortar fire rained down. Buildings burned. The paratroopers held their ground, convinced that relief was coming. It wasn't. 64 miles to the south, Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks' XXX Corps, the armored spearhead meant to link up with the airborne forces, was crawling up a single elevated highway. The road, barely 2 lanes wide, ran through flat, waterlogged terrain. German anti-tank guns picked off British Shermans one by one. Blown bridges forced delays. Bottlenecks stretched for miles. The radios didn't work. Air support never arrived. The timeline collapsed. By September 21, Frost's ammunition was gone. His men were wounded, exhausted, and surrounded. The bridge, the prize they'd bled for, was lost. The disaster was now inevitable, and the cost was about to become catastrophic. September 21, 1944, Oosterbeek, Holland. The British 1st Airborne Division no longer existed as a fighting force. What remained was a collection of ghosts, exhausted, bloodied paratroopers clinging to shattered buildings in a shrinking perimeter west of Arnhem. They called it the Cauldron, and it was burning. Major General Roy Urquhart commanded men who had not slept in days. They fought house to house against Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns that prowled the streets like predators. German artillery pounded their positions without mercy. Snipers picked off anyone foolish enough to move in daylight. The Red Devils, Britain's elite airborne troops, were being systematically destroyed. Supply drops were supposed to save them. Instead, they became another tragedy. Allied transport aircraft roared overhead, dropping canisters of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. But the drop zones were wrong. Most fell into German hands. The paratroopers watched, helpless, as the enemy collected the very supplies meant to keep them alive. The radios didn't work. They had never worked. The frequencies issued to the airborne forces were incompatible with those used by the ground units and air support. Communication collapsed. Calls for help went unanswered. It was an oversight approved at the highest levels, a failure of planning that cost lives by the hundreds. By September 21, over 1,400 British paratroopers were dead. Thousands more were wounded, captured, or missing. Eisenhower authorized reinforcements. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, commanded by Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, dropped south of the Rhine that same day. They landed straight into a killing field. German anti-aircraft fire shredded the transports. The ferry across the river had been destroyed. The Rhine itself had become a death trap, swept by German machine guns and mortars. The Poles could not cross. They could not help. Publicly, Eisenhower and Montgomery remained optimistic. Montgomery told reporters the operation was 90% successful. Behind closed doors, they knew the truth. Market Garden had failed, but neither man would say it. Not yet. On the night of September 25, Urquhart made the only decision left to him: retreat. Under cover of darkness and a violent rainstorm, British and Canadian engineers ferried the survivors across the Rhine in small assault boats. The river was black and swollen. German patrols hunted the shoreline. Men paddled in silence, praying the darkness would hide them. Some boats capsized. Others were hit by mortar fire. But slowly, painfully, the evacuation continued. By dawn on September 26, it was over. 2,163 men had made it across, out of the 10,000 who had dropped 9 days earlier. Behind them, they left 1,485 dead, over 6,400 captured. The wounded who could not be moved were left in the care of Dutch civilians and German medics. The Red Devils had been annihilated. There were no victory parades, no triumphant headlines, just the quiet burial of a military catastrophe and the unspoken question that would haunt commanders for the rest of the war. Who was responsible? October 1944, Supreme Headquarters, Versailles. The telegrams piled up on Eisenhower's desk: casualty reports, after-action summaries, requests for explanations. Market Garden had failed and the world wanted to know why. 17,000 Allied casualties. An entire Airborne Division was destroyed. The Rhine still in German hands. The war would not end in 1944. It would drag on through a brutal winter and into the spring, perhaps longer. For Eisenhower, the failure was more than military. It was political. Market Garden had been sold to the press, to Churchill, to Roosevelt, as a bold stroke of genius, a daring maneuver that would shorten the war and save thousands of lives. Now it was exposed as a disaster, and disasters needed someone to blame. Eisenhower had two choices. He could admit that he had approved a flawed plan based on ignored intelligence, faulty logistics, and unrealistic timelines, or he could deflect blame. He chose deflection. Enter Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery was brilliant, arrogant, and politically toxic. He had publicly criticized Eisenhower's broad front strategy, arguing instead for a concentrated thrust into Germany under his personal command. He had alienated General George Patton, General Omar Bradley, and most of the American high command with his condescending attitude and relentless self-promotion. He was insufferable. And he was the perfect fall guy. In the weeks following Market Garden, Eisenhower carefully reshaped the narrative. In official reports to the combined chiefs of staff, the operation became Montgomery's plan. Eisenhower's enthusiastic approval was downplayed. His role in diverting resources from Patton and Bradley was minimized. The intelligence failures, the ignored reconnaissance photos, the dismissed warnings about German armor were buried in bureaucratic silence. The story that emerged was simple. Montgomery had been overconfident. He had been reckless. He had pushed too hard, too fast, with insufficient planning. The press bought it. American newspapers, already skeptical of British leadership, ran with the narrative. Montgomery became the architect of failure, the glory-seeking field marshal whose ambition had cost thousands of lives. Churchill, desperate to preserve Anglo-American unity, did not defend him. To do so would have meant confronting Eisenhower and risking the alliance. Montgomery was expendable. The alliance was not. Even Montgomery himself, strangely blind to the political maneuvering around him, accepted responsibility. He believed he could salvage his reputation through future victories. He believed the historical record would vindicate him. He was wrong. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower worked to protect his own legacy. In private letters to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, He framed Market Garden as a tactical setback, not a strategic blunder. He praised the courage of the airborne troops. He spoke of lessons learned. He carefully distanced himself from the decision-making. The truth, however, was undeniable. Eisenhower had approved every element of Market Garden. He had signed the orders. He had diverted supplies and resources. He had known the intelligence reports existed and had allowed them to be dismissed. He had gambled on a single narrow thrust into German-held territory, betting everything on speed and surprise. And when the gamble failed, when the bodies piled up and the bridges fell, he let Montgomery take the fall. History, written by the victors, would remember Market Garden as Montgomery's folly. But the decision had always been Eisenhower's. Market Garden didn't just fail, it changed the course of the war. By committing men, aircraft, supplies, and political capital to a doomed offensive in Holland, Eisenhower had starved other fronts. General George Patton's Third Army, poised to strike toward the Saar River and into Germany's industrial heartland, sat idle for lack of fuel and ammunition. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, positioned to breach the Siegfried Line, was forced to halt and consolidate. The delay gave Germany something it desperately needed: time. Throughout October and November 1944, German forces used that time to regroup, reinforce the Siegfried Line, and prepare a counteroffensive that would stun the Allied High Command. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his last major offensive through the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. It would kill 19,000 Americans, wound over 60,000 more, and delay the Allied advance by 6 weeks. Could it have been prevented? Could those men have been saved if Market Garden's resources, the fuel, the ammunition, the airborne divisions, had been used to push Patton or Bradley forward instead? Military historians still argue the question, but the timeline is undeniable. Market Garden consumed critical weeks in the autumn of 1944, and those weeks had consequences. The human toll extended far beyond the battlefield. In Arnhem and the surrounding towns, Dutch civilians who had sheltered Allied paratroopers were hunted down by the SS. They were shot in the streets, hanged in public squares, or sent to concentration camps. The city of Arnhem itself was systematically evacuated. The Germans looted homes, stole food, stripped buildings of anything valuable. What remained was left to rot. And then came the hunger winter. With the liberation stalled and rail lines destroyed, food supplies to Western Holland were cut off. The winter of 1944 to 1945 became one of starvation. Over 22,000 Dutch civilians died from hunger, cold, and disease, a direct consequence of the failed operation that was supposed to free them. Market Garden had consumed 17,000 Allied casualties for zero strategic gain. The British 1st Airborne Division, the Red Devils who had held Arnhem Bridge against impossible odds, was never rebuilt. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, sacrificed in a desperate attempt to reinforce the bridgehead, lost a third of its strength. And yet, when the war ended in May 1945, it was Eisenhower who stood at the center of victory. His reputation was intact. His legacy is secure. He would go on to become President of the United States, celebrated as the architect of Allied triumph. Montgomery, by contrast, became a footnote, a controversial figure remembered more for his failures than his victories. Market Garden followed him like a shadow, overshadowing his success at El Alamein, his steady professionalism during the Normandy campaign, his role in Germany's final defeat. The truth of who really owned Market Garden, who approved it, who knew the risks, who made the final call, was buried in classified files and sanitized memoirs. History is written by the victors, but sometimes the victors rewrite themselves. The war ended in May 1945. The world celebrated. Parades filled the streets. Eisenhower stood at the heart of it all, supreme commander, architect of victory, the man who had led the Allies from the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin. In the years that followed, he became President of the United States, twice. His memoirs, published in 1948, became bestsellers. In them, Market Garden was mentioned briefly, a tactical setback, unfortunate but not decisive. A few paragraphs, nothing more. Montgomery, by contrast, wrote extensively about the operation. Book after book, defending his decisions, analyzing the failure, insisting that the plan had been sound but the execution flawed. He never fully understood that he had been sacrificed, that the narrative had been shaped around him, that history had already made its judgment. But history was not finished. In the 1970s, declassified documents began to surface. Intelligence reports from September 1944 showed that SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, had known about the SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem before the drop. Reconnaissance photos had been reviewed, warnings had been raised, and then buried. Minutes from planning meetings revealed Eisenhower's active role in approving Market Garden. He had not been a passive observer. He had championed the operation. He had diverted resources. He had made the call. Post-war interviews with British officers exposed the systemic failures that had doomed the mission. The radios that didn't work, because the wrong frequencies had been issued at the command level. The air support that never arrived, because coordination between ground and air forces had not been prioritized. The intelligence that had been ignored, because admitting the risk would have meant scrapping the operation. These were not field-level mistakes. They were command-level decisions. Eisenhower was not a coward. He was a coalition leader navigating impossible political pressures. He held together American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces under a unified strategy in a war that demanded constant compromise. He balanced egos, national interests, and competing priorities with skill that few could match. But in protecting his position, he violated a fundamental principle of leadership: owning your decisions. Market Garden was his gamble, his approval, his responsibility, and when it failed, he let another man carry the burden. This pattern is not unique to Eisenhower. It echoes through modern military culture, where accountability is often filtered through institutional politics. Where failure is managed, narratives are controlled, and the truth is sanitized for public consumption. But soldiers know the difference. In 1974, Major General Roy Urquhart, commander of the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, gave an interview reflecting on the battle. His words were measured, careful, but pointed. He said, "We did our job. We held the bridge. What happened afterward was not a failure of soldiers. It was a failure of command." And that command, history would eventually reveal, sat not in Montgomery's headquarters in Brussels, but in Eisenhower's office in Versailles. The men who fought at Arnhem deserve to be remembered not as victims of Montgomery's arrogance, but as soldiers who did everything asked of them, and more. They held a bridge for 4 days against an SS Panzer Corps. They fought without air support, without resupply, without hope of reinforcement. They did not fail. The command that sent them there did.